with us a freelance journalist, Anand Tomartagal, from Mongolia, to speak with us a little bit about press freedom issues there. Anand, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Absolute pleasure. So, Anand, you've worked in the freelance journalism space there for a while with some
Yeah.
major brands and outlets internationally as well. You've been published in, Foreign Policy, Reuters, Business Insider, most recently with an excellent video on Mongolia's COVID response. A number of others as well, AFP. How did you get into journalism?
It's a funny story actually. So I used to be an English teacher before getting into journalism, and I I taught my students that there isn't many Mongolians who actually write in English that are proficient, and there isn't any like Mongolian writers who are very well known. Like in Japan, they have a lot of Japanese people who write in English, who um, who who gives stories about Japan in English, and I told them that there's all of those Asian countries have those people, but Mongolia is probably one of the countries that don't have those people. And I told my students that you could be one of those people if you just try writing better and learn English. You know, it could be the first Mongolian to write stories about Mongolia to a foreign audience. And one of my students told me like, then why don't you do it? And I was a little taken aback by that comment, and one day I thought like maybe I should do it. And actually I was doing I was actually translating for a one freelance journalist, and his name is Bijan, and he really encouraged me like just do it, just start pitching stories to publications, and you can do a lot of things. And I did that, and that's how I started out in journalism. And my wife also helped in a way also because she's also a journalist.
She is. You are a journalism power couple, right? She has written for AFP for a long time, and
Yes.
do some of the best reporting to come out of Mongolia. So, full disclosure, I used to live in Mongolia. Yes, I am in a yurt or ger, as they are called, but I'm currently in Colorado. My property just happens to have one. So, I hear, ironic, the place where I'm staying now. So I feel right at home. I was a freelance reporter for several years in Mongolia. Anand and I worked together. Just so everyone's clear on that, we've worked on a number of video projects and other kind of reporting collaborations. Anand, tell me about the state of the media environment in Mongolia. You know, for those who are joining who aren't familiar, Mongolia ranks 73rd on the Global Press Freedom Index overall.
Hmm.
Tell
Hmm.
us a little bit about the media.
So, so the Mongolian media scene is that there's a history that newspapers was the cornerstone of Mongolians' freedom, actually independence, and that I think I forgot the title of the newspaper, but in the early 1900s, where Mongolia was basically like a pseudo state to the Manchu Chinese Empire. What would happen is that a few Mongolians would print out papers of freedom, and then they would tell stories of Mongolians all over and how they're doing the fight and where they should meet. They printed those out outside of the bigger area of Mongolia in the 1900s, and so basically Mongolia has a history of press freedom. Press was their initial thing, was part of the thing that gave us the freedom. And when Mongolia became a democracy in the 90s, the media industry blew up. Basically, a lot of so all the state-owned local newspapers and media some of the people splintered off and started out their own news organizations, and that came with a positive and a negative. And the positive would be more press institutes and less control of the state of what the media has to say about the government and all of its things. But the bad side of it is that there wasn't any like semblance of press ethics and how to report on things that were deemed newsworthy. And one of the things is that more stories of like yellow journalism became more prevalent in Mongolia. Uh, yeah, and during the 2000s, more and more people who started to become rich because Mongolia became a democracy and the markets and the free market system, and more people who became rich start to own their media companies, and that benefited them because it became their mouthpiece on on themselves, on praising themselves and what they wanted to tell to the Mongolian public on what kind of messaging they wanted to tell to the public. And I think from that, a lot of small media organizations popped up everywhere, and that's one of the biggest problems in Mongolia in media wise, because it's oversaturated at the moment, and there's way too many newsrooms, way too many broadcast stations, and way too many news websites, and and you would think that the free market system would just weed all those out, but it doesn't, because the owners know these media organizations are valuable for them, so they would just pump money in those companies, just for the sake of having their own mouthpiece in in a certain way.
Wow. So
Yeah,
that's
so that's just the whole big gist of. There's more to it than that, but that was just a bit a gist of it, I would say.
so the history and current state of Mongolian journalism in a nutshell. There,
Yeah,
interesting. So you mentioned kind of the long history of the free press in Mongolia. Then during kind of the Soviet era, in particular, right?
before the Soviet era, almost predating the Soviet era.
Right, the tradition of these pamphlets you're saying for
Yeah,
yeah, spreading information. Um, Fascinating. And then since Mongolia's transition to democracy, uh, counterintuitively, the kind of plethora of outlets that has really exploded, the sheer number of Mongolia's media outlets are sometimes shocking. And you'd think that this would be a good thing for the state of the press. Ironically, it sounds like in a lot of cases, these outlets are owned by individuals who are powerful, either business personalities or politicians, right? And so
yes.
they're very biased, it sounds like, and not transparent about that. Would you characterize that as such?
Uh, uh, I think they're not transparent in a way that like they want to hide anything. It's just that there isn't any a legal framework of making those more transparent at the moment, and that's a big issue. So I can probably start like a company, and then that company can own the media company, and it wouldn't show that I was actually the owner. So that's the framework that we're working with.
Right. Interesting. I just want to greet a couple of our commenters here. Randy from New York, welcome. Pablo and Mark from Los Angeles, welcome. We have Avenged Viper 1 from London. Thanks for tuning in. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those in regardless of where you're watching, whether you're watching through the HAPS app directly or on Twitter or Facebook. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and feel free to drop a question here for Anand. or myself. So, Anand, tell me a little bit about some of the stories that you've reported over the past few years since you made this transition from educator to journalist, inspired in part by your student.
Yes.
Very, very cool. You've been essentially self-taught. Would you say that's a fair description of your?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
Uh-huh.
So in the beginning, I only thought about maybe doing stories that were not too political or not too risque.
Uh-huh.
And the first stories I did was actually stories of Mongolian artists, and I thought those people had very few representation. And I thought about, okay, I only will focus on culture and arts, and I will never go into politics because it can be quite dangerous if you go into those fields, and you will get some kind of backlash, and people might threaten you in some way or form.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought of that, like I shouldn't do those things. But eventually, the interest of me doing those more risque stories took over, and I've done stories that kind of does not show the Mongolian leaderships in a good light,
Mm-hmm.
especially our president and our current government. Uh,
Right. So I'd love to hear more about that. First, hi from Florida, says Jenny Green. Thanks for joining us, Jenny. Anand, tell me a little bit about some of those stories that maybe the government was not particularly fond of. It sounds like you're doing real journalism then, if you're making people upset in positions of power. So that's what we like to see. But tell us a little bit about that in particular. We can put some images on screen. There we go.
okay, so I think which story was it? Yeah, the hunting story for ProPublica for when Donald Trump Jr. came to Mongolia in
Uh-huh.
2019 in August. There was a local news report that he came to Mongolia and he went to the Altai Mountains. That's in the western side of Mongolia, and most of the local headlines was that he just went there to hike the mountains and
Mm-hmm.
nothing else, and nothing more to that.
Right.
But it was kind of for me it was kind of sketchy just for that person to go there and hike, and I just left it at that then. But my one of my close friends and your friends also, William Taylor, told me about that. Donald Trump Jr. might have hunted in the area that he went. He hunted a big wild sheep, and
Mm-hmm.
that got me interested. And I followed that lead and found out that he did hunt sheep in that area. And then the funny thing is that, like, one of the first few stories in the local newspapers and in the local news website, there was one comment that said, like, about his trip and his hike to the mountains, whatever. It said that, okay, oh, okay, as long as he's not hunting, I'm okay with that. That was the first comment on that news article, and of him hiking in the Altai Mountains. And ironically, that person's wish wasn't correct. That he was actually going there and hunting. And uh,
Right.
what happened was that
Yeah. Go ahead. I was just going to say
so
the conflict of interests and, what really made it noteworthy and potentially nefarious or at least shady.
So the things that made it shady was that in Mongolia, the hunting argali is very tied with politics and with power. So in Mongolia, they would every year they would issue a quota to hunt argalis, like so that it, their logic is that they can hunt out the old argalis that are just flocking the young argalis not to mate or whatever. and so they will have like specific quotas. Like say this year we will give like 25 or 30 argolas to be hunted. But the
Argali
thing is that
sheep for those who aren't familiar, right? Just to
yeah. Oh yes. Sorry.
clarify.
Yes. It's
Uh-huh.
a very big sheep. It has very majestic horns. And so every year since 2009, the quotas has been increasing every year. It's been first 17 and 25 and just kept on going. And when Donald Trump Jr. came, I think the quota was around 70 to 80, and that's still a lot. And what would happen is that these quotas are usually reserved for hunting companies, but the hunting companies who would get those quotas usually buy them out from government officials, and those are kind of undisclosed. It's just they're known about, but they're not really said. And one of the things that would really made it of a big issue was that when Donald Trump hunted the animal, the licensing to hunt the animal was given after he killed the animal. So that was a big no-no. And one of the things that I learned is that they did that because it was like an insurance. Because as I said before, the quotas are very few, and maybe they were trying to sweeten the deal. If he missed the shot, they'd be like, okay, you missed the shot. We will not issue you a license and something like that. So, and that's why they probably gave the license afterwards. But I cannot verifiably say if it's true or not. And so those kind of things are that was the shady parts, of the hunt.
Sure,
And if you have
certainly.
any questions,
Right, certainly seems odd for anyone to obtain a permit or license after killing an animal.
yes,
Um,
yes,
yeah, the fact that it's in endangered species aside. Uh,
yes.
but tell us a little bit about some of your other reporting more recently. I'd love to put up on screen. I'll actually allow you to intro it. Then we're going to put our volume down, and I can actually put some of their B-roll on screen of your beautiful visuals that you shot for this. But tell us what we're going to see here. Your Business Insider video.
So I did a reporting for Business Insider for Mongolia's response to the coronavirus efforts. So previously, a lot of foreign publications have or people have praised Mongolia for having one of the best responses to the virus, but there's some um, how can I say, like, failures to those response, and I try to show that failures in this reporting.
Fantastic. So I'm going to take our volume down real quick here on it, and then we're going to put about a minute or so of your footage here on screen. You'll also want to and you'll also want to mute yourself on the device real quick here so we can show this. Okay, so with that little teaser, I will encourage people to check out Anand's video. Anand, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but the
I
volume
think you're
is
still
still
muted, so
down.
bring your volume back up so we can talk a little bit about this reporting. Some great visuals from the Nottingham Summer Sports Festival there, from around Ulaanbaatar, the capital. Anand, talk to me. How's your volume looking here? How about now? Try it now.
Okay. Can
There we
you
go.
hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
Okay. Uh, so so as you heard at the end of the video of Mongolians being stranded abroad, that was one of the central points of the reporting is that we had a very good response that we shut out our borders, but we closed our borders way too tight that our own citizens that
Mm-hmm.
weren't able to come back, and those who who could come back, they they were quarantined for 21 days, and sometimes the accommodations that the government offered was was very was very bad. It's just some of them weren't clean and had some infestations, and the running water was polluted and all that. And I think there's an echo. There's one person commented. Uh, yeah, so our government also charged people to come back, and and not many Mongolians have the money to pay for a two-way ticket plane to return home, and they had to pay the accommodations for 21 days when they were in quarantine. So those were the hurdles they have to go through. There were stories of some Mongolians who had to sell their own homes to come back, and sometimes um, it, they couldn't get on the list that people that were prioritized. They had to bribe some officials, but I cannot confirm that in any way. But I've I've heard from people that either they had to bribe people or they had to pay huge amounts of money to come back, and that's one of the biggest issues that Mongolia has in its coronavirus effort is that we did beat the virus in one way, but in doing so, we basically ignored our citizens who were living abroad, and yeah, and we basically had very indecent treatments towards those people, and I think their rights as humans were violated because uh, a lot of them were running out of money to some like people who were in America. I know I lived in America, and the some of the expenses can be quite high, and if you don't have a legal residence citizenship, you cannot work. And during a pandemic, even if you could get a work, it's just it's just a nightmare that they're basically living in, and just everything piled up on top of that. So I try to give that glimpse of the story in this reporting.
Right. And is this reporting showing up in the local media in Mongolia? Are these stories being covered adequately, in your view, in Mongolian language? The fact, that
Um,
folks are stranded abroad.
no, so only few newsrooms and news sites have covered these issues. The biggest Mongolian national broadcaster rarely covers these kind of issues. They would talk about it in a sense, but they would not give a sense of what kind of of issue that these people are going through. They don't really show those things, and that's kind of disheartening because our national broadcast media is the biggest one, and it covers all of Mongolia, and uh, not every Mongolian has access to the internet to read up on the news, and the only thing they can rely on is TV, and they don't have all of the channels, and they just have one channel, and then that that channel is the national broadcaster, and they're very more in line with the government and not as a more of a independent news source. They do give out good information. They do good reporting, but if it's very controversial, they would not touch the issue if it hurts the government in certain ways. So they would not touch the issue and they would just leave it at that.
Wow. And can you tell us, what are some of the threats that journalists face in Mongolia? I understand, in 2017 there was a controversial law passed oriented towards clamping down on libel and slander,
Yes.
which imposes massive fees, multiple times the monthly salary per infraction that a journalist would potentially be penalized for. So, tell us a little bit about what the state are of the media and some regulations to muzzle the free press in Mongolia.
So, so in Mongolia, we have I don't know how to say the English word, but yeah, like there's like a libel. Uh, so what would happen? A defamation lawsuit. So
Mm.
people would. There's a law where you can just go to the police if somebody defamed you in one way or other, or they spread something false about you. You can just go to the police and report those. And most of the time, what happens is that journalists would report some issues, like very controversial issues, and the person who's been said like who's uh, um, who's being wronged, they would go to the police and say, okay, this person made a false news article about me, and most of the time, what would happen is that uh, the journalist would lose in certain ways because uh, the police should not be the people who are enforcing libel in any way because they don't have a wide range of knowledge of the legal frameworks of Mongolia, and they don't know the nuances of actually about press freedom. And I think there was one interesting reporting a few years back where a local journalist found about one local government official who used government money to go to foreign countries 15 times. So in the article it says this local official went to 15 foreign locations on government money, and that person said, "No, I did not do that. I did not do that." And he went to the police and saw defamation lawsuits. And what they found out that was that he actually went 13 times on local government money to foreign countries, but and so he basically won, and she had to she had to say she had to delete the reporting, and she had to give around how much, like 2,000, around $2,000. I'm not sure, but yeah, that kind of money is quite a lot for local journalists. Local journalists don't get paid as much at all. The the minimum salary for a month for a local journalist is around 200 US dollars. So
Right.
that's so
That's could be
just
your
a
whole
framework of that.
year's
So
worth of income potentially. So,
yeah,
Anand, we're getting a question, I believe, from Reddit. Heard that China was stepping into Mongolia like in India. Is this true?
no, no. Well, this I think this person is referring to the Inner Mongolian.
Mm,
No, no. There's no any factual truth to this that China is going stepping into Mongolia. Uh, If they are, I'm not. I don't know anything about it though.
uh-huh. So, one thing that's also worth mentioning, perhaps, is this ban on education in Mongolian language in Inner Mongolia. Perhaps that's what this viewer may be referring to, but
Maybe.
unclear. Yeah, so Mongolia, the separate nation, has sovereign borders, which, to all of our knowledge, are not being infringed upon. That said, for Mongolians, ethnic Mongolians who live within China, in what's often called Inner Mongolia, there are certain restrictions. Language education, in particular, which has become very controversial, and these recent efforts by Chinese government to shift education language for most of the classes, at least for students who traditionally have been schooled in their native tongue, is causing quite an uproar, and there's been a number of protests there. Anand, is this something that people are aware of in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar?
Yes, yes, and I think this issue actually uh, um, spurs more hate towards Chinese, and so in a broader context, a lot of Mongolians are not very found or fond of Chinese people. We have a very bad history with China, and there's a lot of hate groups like alt-right groups that are vehemently against Chinese people who would seek out Chinese people and try to beat them up. And I think these kind of issues actually exacerbates those kind of things. And one of the things that I'm seeing is that those groups are being venerated now because those are the people who are actually more are the people who are more standing up to the inner Mongolians whose rights are being like trampled on.
Mm. Wow. Well, Anand, do you have any other topics that you'd like to touch upon or messages that you'd like folks to know and understand about Mongolia's media environment before we sign off this week's episode of Journalism Under Fire?
Okay, yes. As I was saying about the story of the woman who was reporting about the local corruption issues, is that she the police gave a bad verdict, but the story of this thing maybe should not get the whole facts right. That yes, the person did 13 flights, went to 13 countries on government money, but the issue was that this person was using government funding to benefit himself. That was the main issue, the main information reporting that she did. It's not about the small nuances. And I think that's one of the big issues that Mongolia has, is that journalists are stifled by this framework of being sued and being wronged in ways. And what happens because of that is that journalists here, they censor themselves. And I've seen good journalists who give up journalism because of that. Because in journalism, you cannot get every fact right if you, but the whole messaging the whole the majority of your reporting, if it's correct, it should be deemed good reporting in a sense that you're doing a role for the public. But what happens in Mongolia is that if you make a small mistake in your reporting in some way, those are the things that sometimes judges or law enforcement people just pick up on and say like, oh, you did this wrong. And what happens in Mongolia is that sometimes if a journalist is called into the courts, that they say, okay, this person called in to say you defamed him. I know in America, if you get defamed, the plaintiff needs to show the proof that the journalist didn't get the facts straight. But in Mongolia, what happens is that the journalist needs to show the facts, not the other way around, and it becomes a whole messy issue.
Got it. Wow. So it sounds like the relatively minor mistakes, which normally would be, incorporated into an updated version of an article, can
Yes.
result in legal action, where the journalist specifically has to defend themselves in court often. And it seems like police can directly uh, be imposing these fines and legal infractions themselves without any due process in court. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it might have changed. I need to look into it more.
Okay,
I'm not a legal scholar, so but
no
yeah,
worries.
though that's basically what's the main issue in Mongolia's media.
Well, Anand, thank you so much for your time today. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show here. I hope folks out there learned something about Mongolia's media environment and history. Thank you for the reporting you're doing. It's always great to see. I will post some links to Anand's recent work, including the Business Insider video, which I highly recommend watching. Has some great, visuals of traditional Mongolian sports and cultural events, as well as some really important content about how Mongolia has been able to control the coronavirus. No deaths there, thank goodness. Hope that continues, but at a cost. Those are, Mongolians, many tens of thousands potentially, are still stuck abroad. So important reporting there. Your latest out yesterday. I'll put the link here in the comments. But thank you for your time, on, and pleasure to have you on the
Thank
show.
you for having me.
All the best. Thanks for
Okay.
joining us here on Journalism Under Fire.